Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Duke Football Coverage Podcast, brought to you as always by Bull City Coordinators. You can find us on Twitter at Duke FB Coverage. You know where else you can find us. Send us an email, bullcitycoordinators@gmail.com. Our DMs are open on Twitter. And you can get us anywhere you get your podcasts. Not only is this another interview for the season, it is also the last interview of season 3 before we transition to season 4. And because last episode we did a breakdown of the old Atlantic Division teams, we are now going to do a breakdown of the old Coastal Division teams, leaving out Notre Dame. I don't really count them as a member of the conference. I will not go over that again, nor will I discuss my many problems with Notre Dame and what they've done to the ACC, or what it's done to the ACC, rather. But what we will do is we will bring on our next guest, who is the co-host of the All Sports Discussion podcast, which covers all things ACC related. It is a great podcast. I highly recommend it to you. There are links, I believe, on the site, so go check it out if you're not already doing it. And you can follow our next guest at his Twitter account at Talkin' ACC Sports. That's Talkin' without a G. How are you doing, Jeff?
I'm doing good this evening. Glad to be talking some ACC football.
Absolutely. We're getting in that nice period where everybody's getting real excited about it, starting to line up some tickets for games, and also probably thinking about some of the stuff that we talked about the last time you were on here, which was the announcement of the 3-5-5 and expansion and the future of the ACC. And now you're back. A lot of expansion rumors still going on, although not as many as there were a little bit ago. And we're about to see the 3-5-5 come into play. So not that much has changed, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think with the realignment stuff, and that's just going to be on the radar as like background noise for the next several years. It's just kind of where the ACC is right now, and we might can talk about that later. But for the next several years, no matter what anyone says, nothing's going to happen. But for sure they got to work on revenue. There's no question about that.
Well, tell us a little bit about your podcast and where we can keep up with you.
Yeah, you can find the podcast at allsportsdiscussion.com. Right now, my co-host and I, Matthew, he's known as ASD_Hokie Smash. He's my co-host. We're just about finished with our ACC team previews. We usually get a blogger or fan or someone who covers one of the ACC teams to go through, the strengths and the weaknesses, looking ahead to the 2023 football season for that team. And we're just about at the end. We got 3 more schools to do. And usually we have that on Sunday nights and post it on Monday. And you can also find me on Twitter, like I said, at Talking ACC Sports, and allsportsdiscussion.com is where we, put the thoughts down on the ACC on paper.
How many episodes are you up to on the podcast? If you don't have the exact number, you can ballpark it.
We're around like 460 episodes. It's kind of a grassroots thing that Matthew and I have been doing the last 10 years, looking at the ACC, getting a variety of guests on. We're having a good time with it, and the guests like yourself, they've just been great. Make it fun.
Well, I enjoy listening to it, especially come football season. It helps me keep up with teams for games that I don't have a chance to watch. And with basketball season, it's hit or miss when I can actually see what's going on. So it's a great summary for what's going on in the league, in the conference, while we still have it, which we can talk about a little bit more later. But we're here. You are a fan of a Coastal Division, former Coastal Division team. Your Yellow Jackets. I'm a fan of a former Coastal Division team, the Blue Devils. So why don't we hop right in and get straight to what we've got coming up this year. And before we go through it team by team, just generally, what are your thoughts about the end of the divisions?
Yeah, I think it was a long time coming, and it's the right thing to do, especially with um, the advent of the playoffs. Expanding to the 12 teams. I mean, you're going to want to have your best two teams playing in the championship game. I think in the past, if you had a Clemson facing a Coastal Division team that, honestly, that Coastal Division team in the last few years would have been overmatched. Well, not I wouldn't say the last few years, but during Clemson's kind of heyday, uh, it worked to their advantage because Clemson would usually win that game, go ahead and march into the playoffs. But now, if you had just the four teams and you suffered a loss in that game in the ACC championship game, you want to be able to get that championship. If you have a team that's ranked 12 or 13 and you're playing a top 5 team, that team can get into the playoffs. So I think it enhances the league. It enhances the matchup. It's good for the future playoffs. If you'd had it in the past, I don't think it had been as impactful as it's going to be in the future. So, and I think it also creates more, better matchups within the ACC. You're not going to go those 6 or 7 years that ACC teams went without sometimes facing each other in those cross divisions. I think if I remember right, if you're a member of one of the schools, you'll play at least one time during your 4 years at an ACC school against one of the other ACC schools, and I think that's just going to create a lot more variety in the matchups, and I'm glad the ACC did it.
I think it's a great idea, primarily for that last reason that you mentioned. I think it's been since 2013 that Duke has played NC State, which does not make any sense.
Right.
They may have played during the COVID year. I can't remember, but that doesn't really count. But also, to your larger point, if Clemson and FSU have the seasons that they are projected to have this year, those are the teams you want to see play for the ACC championship, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we've seen, when the ACC has a high quality matchup in its championship game with playoff implications, the game does very well in the ratings. It's a misconception that people aren't going to watch ACC football. They want to watch good football, and it's going to create a really good matchup in the championship game.
Well, with that out of the way, that little bit of background, why don't we go through the coastal teams, and why don't we see what we think those teams are going to do, and get your thoughts on each of them. And I pulled them up by standing. So guys who are listening, I am not mentioning this first team out of any respect or love or kindness or appreciation for them. But why don't we get your thoughts on what we can expect from UNC or Chapel Hill College, as it is customarily known?
I think it's all going to begin and end with North Carolina on their defense. Drake May had a fantastic season last year. He was on the short list of Heisman candidates late into the year before they lost to Georgia Tech and NC State. But he's a proven commodity. He's a first round NFL pick, likely. Even if he has a poor season, he's probably going to go in the top 3 rounds. So, he's a proven guy, and that always helps when you have, the best. Sometimes, well, we'll see if he's always going to be the best player on the field. But when you have a player of that caliber at the most important position on the field, you're going to like your chances in a lot of games. But the issue with North Carolina has been, their defense. And if they don't get that, right, they're going to be in a lot of shootouts, and which is going to help Jake May's numbers, but it's not going to help their win-loss record. And we saw what happened. You got him moving around in the pocket a little bit more and cut off some of those running lanes that he had earlier in the year, and he did struggle a little bit. So I think the upside of North Carolina is is good, but you're just not sure, how far they can go, because you can't trust that defense to always make the stops that they need to make. And I remember the App State game last year. I think they gave up something like 60 points or something in that game. They won it, but if they don't get that defense in order, there's going to be a lot of shootouts, and then 3 or 4. It's going to a season that could be 10-2 is going to end up like 8-4, 7-5.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is they're just trash and they're going to fall apart. I think that's clearly what you were getting at there. Let's take a look at their schedule real quick. I did this with the last when I had Dan Siegel on, and I think it worked out well, although it wasn't necessarily something that I had intended to do. But let's pull up North Carolina's schedule here real quick and go through it. They're starting off against South Carolina.
Yeah, that's a pivotal game for them, because South Carolina was kind of all over the place last year as a team, but they finished the year really strong. I mean, they blew out Tennessee, knocked them out of the playoffs, and then go on the road and win at Clemson and put an end to that 60-something game winning streak they had at home. But I do think that's a game that North Carolina is capable of winning, and if they win that game, it could really jumpstart their season. But as we saw, I think South Carolina is going to come into that game probably a fringe top 25 team. Come still off a lot of confidence off the end of last season, and they have a lot of expectations in Columbia too. So that's a game that's very pivotal for both teams there.
Then the Tar Heels have App State, which is not going to be a guaranteed win because App State knows how to win games that maybe they shouldn't. And Minnesota, also not guaranteed, 9-4 last year with a win in the Pinstripe Bowl. That's the first three. That's not easy.
Yeah, and I think you give North Carolina a 2-1 start, they would take that.
And then you got Pitt, and Pitt is always deadly. So that's a tough first four. I mean, what are your thoughts on how they should break in those first four?
I mean, it seems a little bit unlikely that they could run the table on those four teams, just for the reasons like that you said. We know South Carolina, they have talent on that team. Minnesota, just like you said, they've been well coached the last several years. That's not maybe a premier Big Ten team, but we know that they're capable. And Pittsburgh is probably the most consistent team that has been in the Coastal over the last several years. I think we can safely say, and we can talk a little bit more about them too, is Pat Narduzzi has them on a solid foundation, where they can change players and still be a team that can win 9-10 games in a season. And then you got to go on the road there at Pitt. So if you're North Carolina and you came out of those first four 3-1, I mean, you are pumped with that. You can take a 2-2 start and a 1-3, even 0-4, and you're wondering if the season's about to spin out of control. So I don't think they can win at Pittsburgh. I think Pittsburgh's become a little bit too stable of a program to win on the road there. I think you get Minnesota, App State, and South Carolina as your toss-up game.
All right, then after that, they've got the bye week, Syracuse, Miami, and Virginia. I think worst case scenario there, you're looking 2-1, but probably three wins, don't you think?
Yeah, I think so. That's where North Carolina's got to make a move on the season, because you're going to be favored certainly against Syracuse and Virginia. Miami, for what talent that they do have. I mean, they really struggled last year. They're a definite wild card of the previous Coastal teams, but that's a game that you should win going into the season. On paper, they're better than Miami. So, they should be able, they should look at those three games and think that they should win those games.
Then they've got Georgia Tech and Campbell, possibly two more wins. It's not inconceivable. I I mean, I think the Campbell one is a win. Georgia Tech, even though I expect more from Georgia Tech this year, I think it's probably a win, although it is on the road. So there's a chance they could go win 5 straight, probably more coming out of their 4-1, don't you think?
Yeah, I do think, Georgia Tech on the whole is going to be upgraded for sure with a full season under Brent Key, with the Jeff Collins nightmare era over. But at the same time, I think it's going to be it's going to be a little bit tough for Georgia Tech to produce the kind of performance defensively they did last year against, Drake May in back-to-back years. I mean, defensively in that game last season, they put out the blueprint on how to slow North Carolina down, and North Carolina had a lot of success slowing down Drake May in North Carolina, and then Clemson definitely shut them down. And then when they got to the bowl game against Oregon, they moved the ball, but they didn't move it at the rate that they did at the beginning of the year. That was just a spectacular defensive performance by Georgia Tech last year in Chapel Hill, and it is a little bit hard to see that they would repeat that, because that was definitely I wouldn't say like a once in a lifetime, but one of the big shockers of ACC games last year.
All right, then the last 3 games, Blue Devils at home, so they'll be probably even worse officiating down and key moments than there was last year. But then they go on the road to Clemson and NC State, which Mac Brown was whining, complaining. We could use other terms about the way his schedule ended. I'd be a little bit more worried about the way my schedule started necessarily, because it's going to be hard to dig out of that. Of those last 3, I think if you're North Carolina, you're looking at 1-2 probably. I mean, the NC State game is going to be tough, and I don't see Carolina beating Clemson.
Yeah, I don't see North Carolina beating Clemson either. I think NC State is kind of a wild card as well from the previous Atlantic teams. How's Brennan Armstrong and Robert and I rejoin? Is he going to produce at the Virginia level? If he does that, if he's at the level that they had the offense going in Virginia a couple years ago, North Carolina is not winning at NC State. But we just don't know if he's going to return to that level of form. And then of course, your Duke Blue Devils coming off their 9-win season, and Riley Leonard and Elko, and what a great job they did. It's if they come out of there with two wins out of those final 3, I'd be really impressed. I mean, it's just kind of a strange schedule for them, because like you mentioned, those first 4 games, pretty tough, and then the final 3 are pretty tough. And if they struggle in the middle of that season at all, it could really derail fast for North Carolina.
So, and I think the Duke Carolina game is going to be a good one, because Duke has one of its oldest teams that it's had in a while. And historically, that is when programs like Duke are able to do well and win games that maybe in other years they don't. But going back through there, we're looking at, I guess, low end 8-4, maybe best case scenario 10-2, but probably hovering around 9-3.
I'm pretty close to that. I would say maybe the floor is 7-5. Because if
I like it.
If things go a little sideways, I think it's possible. But I mean, I can see a ceiling definitely of 10-2 if that defense comes together. So, that 8-4, 9-3 type season is probably what you're looking at. And I mean, I think there's just a little bit too much talent to fall below 7-5. But that would be that would still be really disappointing season for the Tar Heels, because most preseason top 25 polls, have Clemson and Florida State from the ACC, and most of them, if they have a 3rd ranked ACC team, it's been North Carolina.
All right, well, let's switch gears and talk about Pitt, because I think overall that's going to be a pretty good team yet again. They may not be flashy. They may not surprise anybody. But to your point, Narduzzi knows what he's doing. And let's just go through their schedule. Wofford, Cincinnati, West Virginia, North Carolina. What are your thoughts on the first 4? I mean, I'm thinking in my head, 2-2s were absolute worst case scenario, but probably 3-1.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I mean, that's the Wofford game they should take care of, but the next three, they're not gimmies there. In West Virginia, that's a struggling football program right now, but it's on the road, and that's one of the backyard brawl is one of the best rivalries in college football. Last year's game at Pitt was just a great way to start the season. They had game day there. The atmosphere was fantastic. It was a great game. And weird things can happen there, but you get Wofford. You should beat West Virginia. I think you're better than Cincinnati. And we've already said that they're better than North Carolina, that they should win that game. So, I mean, I think if they stub their toe on anyone but the Wofford game, which I think no matter what they win that game, I think 3-1 is the floor on that start, and I could easily see them starting out the year 4-0.
I think that you made some good points, particularly about Cincinnati and West Virginia. I mean, Cincinnati is going to have a head coach who historically is always looking for his next job, in Scott Satterfield. Big coaching change. That's a team that you want to play early. You don't want to play late. That's kind of what that makeup is. So I think that certainly has to favor Pitt. And then their last game before the bye is Virginia Tech. I know they're at Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech seems to be doing well, hitting up to 757 a lot recently in the 804 area codes, recruiting. But coming out of that first five, I think 4-1's highly probable, don't you?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if Pitt's quite good enough to run the table through the first five. They even now, as stable as the program has become, they still seem to have a loss during the course of a year that you're even in these last couple of years that you're just kind of like scratching your head. Where did that come from? I mean, you've just looked last year, they lost that game to Georgia Tech in Brent Key's first game, and that was just completely out of the blue. And they even now they still have a tendency, for that to happen. In the year that they won the ACC, a year that they won, that they beat Tennessee and Clemson, they have that loss to I think it was Western Michigan, if I remember correctly. So I don't think they can quite run the table. 4-1 really sounds good to me.
Okay, then let's look at the remainder of their schedule. Their next three, well, we'll do their next four: Louisville, Wake Forest, Notre Dame, Florida State. That's a rough four, but
Yep.
I think you can probably go 2-2 there, don't you?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm not, playing at Notre Dame is still going to be very tough. Notre Dame's got that really long winning streak, against ACC teams during the regular season. Florida State, I think, I don't think Pittsburgh's going to win that game, but that's one of the ACC's best games of the year, because I think Pittsburgh will have a great atmosphere there. That'll be a big time game. But I mean, you just can't see them knocking off a Notre Dame and Florida State in back-to-back weeks. So if they do that, they're a lot better than I think, and I think they're pretty good. But that's like top 10 good. And Wake Forest, even without some of the departures from last year's team, Dave Clawson always puts together a quality team. I mean, that's a pretty, I think you're going to beat Louisville, in my opinion. But those next three, that's a pretty tough back-to-back group of games there.
Right. The Notre Dame and Florida State, those are not the two you want to play one right after another. Wake, you've got to favor Pitt right now, although you never know with Dave Clawson what they're going to accomplish. Louisville's rebuilding, but those last three are really good for Pitt. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. The football gods will not let us beat Pitt, although I would very much like to see that happen. Based on the history of time, we'll just say. I think you have to take Pitt on to win that game, and you have to take Pitt to beat Syracuse, Boston College, and then close out with a win against the Blue Devils, right?
I think they're definitely, should be able to take care of Syracuse and Boston College. I would put the road, in my opinion, I think the game at Duke is in that toss-up category. Um, I think, especially if Duke's the team, I think that they are. I mean, you could have two, 8 and two teams in that game that are 7, 8 win teams going into that one, and playing for a pretty significant bowl game.
That's right. And we'll remember last year was a close game, and then there was this 2-point conversion, and we'll just blur that out. But I want Duke to win that game. I just, if you just look at the matchup, head-to-head matchup history, and again, I don't know what we did to make the football gods so angry at us that they would not let us beat Pitt, but you can just take a look at it. So that's a tough one. But give us your floor and ceiling, not ceiling is the roof, predictions here for Pitt. What are we looking at?
I think Pitt's established enough that they're going to make a bowl game, but I don't think it would take too much for them, to floor it at 7-5, and I would see the ceiling of them is 9-3. Just because Notre Dame and Florida State are very likely 2 losses, and even as good as Pittsburgh has been the last few years, they still have that one game of year that you didn't see coming for them losing. And so I'm still there with that if you have Notre Dame and Florida State as losses, someone else is going to trip them up at some point in the year. That's why I can't see better than 9-3.
I think you're right. I think you're looking at somewhere around 8 to 9 wins, and looking at what Narduzzi's done since he's been there: 8-5, 8-5, 5-7, 7-7, 8-5, 6-5, 11-3, 9-4. And that was kind of a down year last year. In the last 2 seasons, they finished ranked in the top 25. To your point, 62-41 overall, 41-25 in conference, and championships begin in your conference. So you just can't overlook Pitt, and you got to give them a lot of respect. So I think your view on it is correct. Until they prove otherwise, you have to look at them highly.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of a team with some buzz behind it, we've got the Duke Blue Devils. There is a shot, and as we go through the schedule, that I will be at the Labor Day game against the Tigers. I'm not sure about that yet. I can go into my reasons why, but just briefly, your overall thoughts on the Blue Devils this year.
You can't talk about Duke going into this season without talking about the incredible job that Mike Elko did last year, getting them to 9-4. They should have been a top 25 team in the final polls. I don't think they got quite there. Weren't they like 26? They should have been a top 25 team.
I can't recall where they landed. They started getting votes as the season went on. I think what held them back was their schedule.
Mm-hmm. But, if I had a vote, I would have had them in the top 25, because by the end of the year, that was, a fine football team. And it just sets the bar, at a point where, you look at Duke and you say that, hey, there's no reason they should really take a step back as a team. Maybe they don't go 9-4 again, based on the schedule that we'll kind of look at, but they're going to be a 6, 7, 8 win type team. I mean, you can't overlook them when you play them. I think it's a very dangerous Labor Day game for Clemson coming out of the gate. So I'm pretty high on Duke.
I think they've got a lot of potential this year, again, because of their age, because they have coaches who know what they're doing. They have good players who've been there for a long time, and they have one of the best strength and conditioning coaches in the business. Yeah, he does more than just create Instagram models. But let's go through the schedule. Now, the opening game, and let me just say this. I'm 41 years old. I've watched a lot of Duke football, a lot. And this is the kind of game that everybody gets hyped up for. Everybody wants to make a statement, and everybody wants to see Duke win. And the early season excitement blinds you to the fact that Clemson is still Clemson. So I have a little hesitation to commit to going to that game based on my historical experiences. That said, I think I'm probably going to go, but I hope you all can understand my hesitation. It is a long ride back, especially if your team loses. And Clemson is D-line you. So let's go through the first 5 before the bye week real quick. Clemson, Lafayette, Northwestern, UConn, Notre Dame. What are your thoughts?
I mean, you look at the Clemson and Notre Dame game and the game sandwiched in between. I mean, it looks like a 3-2 start. But if somehow, I mean, you get Notre Dame and Clemson at home, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that that Duke could steal one of those. And if you do that, you're 4-1, and you're probably ranked about 20th in the country. I don't think it's out of the question to think that that's possible. Because one of the things with Clemson, when you look at them, yeah, they're still, player for player, one of the 2 most talented teams in the ACC. But the difference between them now and versus 5 years ago is they don't have the explosive playmakers on offense to just run teams off the field. They might still beat you, but they're not beating you 44-7. They might beat you 27-14 because they still play pretty good defense. Not as good as when Brent Venables was there. And I can get into Clemson, and I still have question marks about Wes Goodwin, their defensive coordinator, but they're just not quite equipped to run quality teams, off of the field. And I think Duke is a quality team. I expect that game to be very competitive, at least through 3.5 quarters going into the fourth quarter. I wouldn't be shocked if it's a 10-point or less game. I feel like Clemson, they're going to play with a big chip on their shoulder too going into that game. So I think they probably will win that one. And if there is an upset brewing there for Duke in those first 5, I kind of look at it maybe with a little bit more possibility of being Notre Dame at home, who last year showed a tendency, to get up for the bigger games. And then they overlooked a few people last year. And I think there's a chance that Duke could be in that position to take advantage. That's a Notre Dame team that blew out Clemson, but loses to Marshall at home. Also lost to Stanford, but then had some other big wins during the course. They beat South Carolina last year in the bowl game. So I think that's a chance for Duke to pull a monumental upset. I'm not brave enough to call it. I'm looking at 3-2, but I give them a puncher's chance against Notre Dame and Clemson.
All right. So I think we're most likely going to see a 3-2 out of the first 5.
Mm-hmm.
Then you got a bye week. And then the schedule does not get easier. NC State, Florida State, Louisville, and Wake Forest. Over those next 4, Wake's a Thursday night game. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is what we were talking about at the beginning. Duke could have as good a team as they did last year and may not achieve that record because there's no gimmies there even in those next 4. After the Notre Dame, NC State, again, same as when we were talking about North Carolina. I think they're going to be really good defensively, but how their ceiling is going to depend on if Brennan Armstrong returns to that form he had 2 years ago at Virginia, when he was just lighting up the ACC. If that Brennan Armstrong is playing in that game, I think that'd be very difficult for Duke to win that one. And then of course at Florida State, I think that's maybe unfortunately the most assured probably loss on the schedule. I think Florida State's going to be very good. At Louisville, uh, I I think Louisville is not going to be an unbeatable team by any stretch, but on the road, another difficult game. And then Wake Forest always has been real competitive series with Duke, but I do think Duke is going to win that game against Wake Forest. So, you look at those four, I see a toss up with NC State, loss at Florida State, at Louisville. I'm going to lean that one's a loss. And then, Wake Forest is probably the one that you got to win out of those two. If you're losing to Wake Forest at home, season's probably going sideways at that point.
All right, then the last three: North Carolina, Virginia, and Pitt.
You're better than Virginia, so even on the road, I think you win that game. That's why I wanted to hit that one first. At North Carolina, on the road, that's the problem. There is some of these games that I feel like Duke could win at home. You go on the road and they become much more difficult. I'm going to say that you lose to North Carolina, you beat Virginia, and then Pittsburgh is your toss-up game. That's the kind of game that maybe for whether Duke can get into a bowl game or not.
I think that's a fair take. So give us your ceiling and floor or floor to ceiling range for the Blue Devils.
I hate to go to this low of a floor because I think Duke has a quality team, but it's the schedule that I think if things go wrong, you get a bad break here or there, and you know it could really be tough to find wins. I'm going to put the floor at 5-7.
All right, give us the ceiling.
And the ceiling, I'll put it 8-4.
I think that's a very reasonable take, primarily because if Duke doesn't steal a win against Clemson or Notre Dame after those first games, it's very likely that they could be 3-4, and then Louisville, you can probably win. Louisville and Wake probably win those two. That gets you to 5. Virginia gets you to 6. But to your point, there's just not much of a margin for error. They don't really have a game that you can say they could lose one and then make it up later. I think with that schedule, Clemson, Notre Dame, NC State, Florida State, North Carolina, Pitt, and that doesn't even take into account Wake and maybe what Louisville could do. I mean, that's a tough schedule. There's just no margin for error there. So I think your interpretation of that is a wise one. Let's look at the next team, and we'll go to your Yellow Jackets. Tell us what. Let's go through that schedule here. They're playing Louisville, South Carolina, Ole Miss, Wake Forest, Bowling Green, and Miami. That's a long time before they get a bye week. What do you think about the start for their season, their first 6?
Yeah, I think they could get caught up in the same thing that we were talking about with Duke. I think they could be an improved team, and the record might not show it because it is still pretty tough. And in that opening game, I think it's going to tell the tale on their season with Louisville at home, and that's a game that I'm probably going to go to. I'm in on the Brent Key era, so I wanted to catch his first game, and hopefully he can do that. But that's a definite toss-up, pivotal game. South Carolina State, you're
Right.
better than. You're not equipped to win at Ole Miss right now. Maybe if that game was in Atlanta, you might have a puncher's chance. But you're not equipped to beat an 8 or 9 type win type SEC team on the road. So I'm going to chalk that one up as a loss. Wake Forest, that's another pivotal game. If there's no way they can start 0-2 with Louisville and Wake Forest, they'll absolutely miss a bowl game if they do that. That's a tough one. You're better than Bowling Green. So, you're looking at probably 2 sure wins, South Carolina State and Bowling Green. a sure loss with Ole Miss, and then you got the two pivotal games with Louisville and Wake Forest. So I'm going to go and say you get a split out of those two.
And I think I said South Carolina instead of South Carolina State earlier. Let me correct that. Here's one good thing, though. You get Wake early.
Yep.
That should be helpful. And Miami, I don't think you really know what to expect. And Louisville, again, you get them early. So that's the time to play those two teams. And if they can come out and win both of those, they're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, probably 4-2 in their first 6, but they got a good chance to be 5-1, depending on what we see from Miami. But I agree with you about Ole Miss. They got the bye week October 14th. They close out the schedule with Boston College, North Carolina, Virginia, Clemson, Syracuse, and Georgia. I mean, I think we all agree that the Bulldogs are going to win that game. But other than that, what do you think about the remaining 6?
Yeah. I don't. Yeah, there's not a scenario where they can knock off Georgia, and you know, I look at the game at Clemson. It's like Ole Miss. You're just not equipped to win that game on the road. So those are your two losses there, and I feel like if you're looking at a 3-3 start, um, you've got Boston College. That should be a win. At Virginia should be a win, and you get Syracuse at home should be a win. North Carolina, like we were talking about earlier, I just don't know if they can produce the kind of game in back-to-back years to beat North Carolina and Drake May 2 times in a row. So, I'm looking at, 3-3 first 6, 3-3 back end, and they sneak into a bowl game, which would be fantastic for Brent Key in his first full year at Georgia Tech.
So I take it your kind of floor for them would be 5-7, ceiling maybe 7-5, but likely they're hovering around 6-6.
Yeah, I think 5-7 would be the floor, and they probably can't go much higher than 7-5 until they build up the talent base. But we saw what Brent Key did last year, beating a couple teams that were, they were better. Those teams would have probably won last year 7 out of 10 times. I think overall Duke was better. Georgia Tech was able to win that game. Pittsburgh was better. North Carolina was better. But he kind of, outkicked his coverage on those games. And I feel like there could be some of that this year as well, but probably not enough to get more than 7 wins.
Still better than the can of tuna. So
yep, still better than the can. The name who's we won't speak about ever at Georgia Tech again.
not a great hire in retrospect. All right,
Yeah.
let's turn to the U, and we can discuss whether the U is broken or not. I'm not particularly high on this team because everybody gets sucked into believing that they're going to be great, and then they kind of crash and burn, which last year was pretty bad. But let's just go through the schedule. With Miami, they've got Miami of Ohio, Texas A&M, Bethune-Cookman, Temple, and then a bye week. I think they're probably starting 3-1.
Yeah, I would look at 3-1. I know that Texas A&M game, they've got their own issues, but if they somehow were to beat the Aggies and Jimbo Fisher, that's why I call them the wild card, because then you're looking at a 4-0 start, and hosting a Georgia Tech team that you would be capable of beating, and all of a sudden that U is back hype train is going to go into overdrive. So if there's a previous Coastal Division team, pivotal game on the schedule, that Texas A&M game is right up there for Miami as South Carolina was for North Carolina. And you get that game at home, and you were in the game last year with Texas A&M. They had an opportunity to win that game, and I thought actually outplayed the Aggies most of it. But they just they just struggled so much at key moments last year. Miami did, and Van Dyke was going into the season, a top 2-round draft pick, and just he was talking about transferring in the offseason, if I remember, I mean, if you get him right, I mean, Miami becomes a much more dangerous team if they can get that offense squared away. And I'm really looking at that Texas A&M game because if they win that game, watch out.
It could be an interesting season for the Hurricanes, but then they've got Georgia Tech, North Carolina, Clemson, and Virginia. I think looking at that fairly, probably beat Georgia Tech. Well, between Georgia Tech and North Carolina, I think they go 1-1. They split those. Clemson and Virginia split those as well. I just don't see a scenario where they beat the Tigers. But what do you think about the next four?
Those Final Four. I mean,
No,
at
no, no.
NC.
Georgia Tech,
Oh, okay.
North Carolina, Clemson, and Virginia.
Yeah. Okay. You should beat Virginia at home. You probably beat Georgia Tech. I don't think you're ready to beat a Clemson at home. No, at North Carolina, I I don't think they can win at North Carolina, but that's certainly not a game that I'm just going to assume that North Carolina be able to win. But I'm going to give them 3-1 through those four.
Okay. And then the last four are interesting. I think probably splitting those NC State, Florida State, Louisville, and Boston College. What do you think about those last four?
Yeah, that looks like a 2-2 finish all the way. Um, you're not winning at Florida State. Think you're better than Louisville. Boston College got its own issues, and NC State. Again, we keep going back to it. Brennan Armstrong, how's that offense gonna be? Because I think NC State has probably got one of the highest, floor versus ceilings of any team in the ACC. Because I think they'll be really good on defense, but you wonder about their offense. But I'm gonna lean that they won't be able to beat NC State either for a 2-2 finish.
So where do you project the Hurricanes to land? Sorry for the terrible wordplay there. For a floor and for a ceiling.
I mean, if things break for them the right way, I think they could hit a 9-3 ceiling. Um, but certainly if they go as they did last year, I mean, their floor is a lot like last year's team. I mean, they could end up missing a bowl game again. I could see them going 5-7 if things go a little sideways. They lose a game they're not supposed to, and then lose it in the games that they're not, you know, where they're going to be underdogs, because there'll be an underdog likely against A&M, probably at North Carolina, for sure Clemson, probably an underdog at NC State, at Florida State. I mean, it's very possible they don't win any of those.
And I will say they're catching the Cardinals late. Jeff Brom could have that team playing its best football right around the end of the season. So I'm not going to go out on a limb and make any projections on that November 18 game now, but I'm saying that's one to watch late. And
Yep.
if the Hurricanes lose that game, I mean, I don't see a scenario where they lose to Boston College regardless, but that could keep them from going to a bowl if things are not going well. So all right, we got the U out of the way. We're hitting the home stretch. We're going to one of the worst teams in the league last year, and that's UVA. What do you think about the Cavs?
I think it could be a pretty long season in Charlottesville. um, it's gonna. I'm sure it was a really hard off season for them. Considering the tragic events at the end of last season. Um, but that aside, frankly, the team just wasn't very good. When you look at what Tony Elliott did, he did something that I think is always a red flag when it comes to new coaches, and that's if you're going to institute your system and you want to do it to such an extent that you completely overhaul what was working to the previous team, to the detriment, of that team. And I mean, you had an offense that was talented at wide receiver last year, had Brennan Armstrong still, and he said it in the offseason. He's like, we're going to try to run the ball and be more balanced. And it just did not work to the extent he did. And, we've talked about Jeff Collins before when he came to Georgia Tech. I mean, he was going to get rid of the triple option. And of course it makes sense. You want to institute your system. But when you do it to such an extent that you don't utilize the talent that's on the team, that's a red flag for me. And for Virginia to not be, like you said, one of the worst teams in the ACC, I think you have to see some more flexibility from Tony Elliott, and something that's not something we really saw from him last year. So that's a question mark. And we've talked about the other ACC teams. I think everyone we've mentioned so far should be improved from what they were last year. Maybe not record wise, but maybe as better teams. So I mean, they've got to. They're not going to get any breaks.
Yeah, and that schedule does not look friendly. Let's just go through it. Tennessee, James Madison, Maryland, NC State. That is a brutal first four. And then Boston College and William and Mary, followed by a bye week. So what do you think about their first six?
I mean, they got no chance against Tennessee. They got no chance to win that game. I don't even know. And then they're playing at Maryland, and Tonga Valoa, who's one of the more athletic quarterbacks in the country. That's just a matter of overscheduling right there. And I don't think you're better than you're not going to be able to beat NC State, even as we've been said it repeatedly. What's Brennan Armstrong going to be like? Even if they're not don't have the offense he had at Virginia, NC State is plenty talented to beat Virginia, and they better not overlook James Madison. I can't see how they come out of that better than 1-3.
Yeah, and then I think they beat Boston College, but William and Mary's upset some teams here and again. So, I don't.
Yeah.
To your point about Elliott, I said this earlier this interview season with Lauren Brownlow. I said Tony Elliott is doing his best Carl Franks impersonation in Charlottesville, and a lot of the stuff that you just mentioned about I'm going to do my system and I'm going to do it my way. That's what Carl Franks did. And he didn't have a team that could run it. And it was a disaster. And we saw, again, I think Franks won 3 games in his first year and Elliott won 3 in his first. And they got to that record in very, very similar ways. So I just, again, we'll see what happens, but I don't like the start of that season for UVA at all. And they've got the detective Mike London there, so we'll see. And last year William and Mary went 11-2.
Yeah, I don't think it's out of the question that they could start the year like where's William and Mary. That's through 6. I mean, I don't think it's out of the question that they start the year 1-5, in an upset in one of those two to James Madison or William and Mary. I don't expect it, but I mean, would any of us be really that shocked? I don't like this Virginia team. I'll be honest on that.
My prediction: pain if you're a Cavaliers fan. And let me tell you, that back 6 don't look too much better. Sorry for the bad grammar, but we're both upstate guys, so it's okay. You got North Carolina, Miami, Georgia Tech, Louisville, Duke, Virginia Tech. There is a better than even chance that they close out the season with 6 straight losses.
Yeah, I mean, you look at that, and we've discussed the other teams. We haven't talked about Virginia Tech, but I mean, we know their historical record against them over the last 20 years. I mean, they just don't beat Virginia Tech in football. It's like a once every 15-year type thing. Yeah, that I think it's gonna. This just doesn't look good, no matter how you slice it. I mean, this season could really get derailed. I mean, oh man, yeah. Well, at least they got you got Tony Bennett there at Virginia for basketball, and got a good baseball program.
I mean, I don't want to ask you the floor to ceiling because I think the floor is not that different from the ceiling. I mean, I think they're hovering around 1 to 2 wins, right?
Yeah, I think so too. Um, I'm gonna say that they find a way that to at least win a couple games, but the floor is pretty low. I'm putting the floor at 2-10, and I think even in the best case scenario, I don't see how they can reach a bowl game. The best I can see them doing, and that's just if a lot of things break right, they pull a couple of upsets, is 5-7.
Would you, what would your odds on that be? I mean, if you were a betting man, I mean, let's just look at James Madison the last couple of years: 14-2, 7-1, 12-2, 8-3. I mean, James Madison, to go with a white chocolate, Jason Williams, Randy Moss reference, ain't scared. I mean,
No,
right?
yeah, I mean, this was a team last year that they were 3-7, and if they don't, they came up with the kind of the upset at Georgia, uh, at Georgia Tech, but I mean, yeah, I mean they were in some games last year. They were in it late with North Carolina, so I'm not going to say this is just like a worst team the ACC has seen. I do think there's a chance that they could sniff a bowl if everything just breaks perfectly. But man, between that schedule and how they were playing last year, it's just really hard to see anything more than 3 or 4 wins. It really looks like a 3 or 4 win team.
So basically, do not pass go, do not collect $200. Now, let's talk about the opposite of that, a team that played better as the year went on, and that is your co-hosts Hokies. Virginia Tech played better late, looked better. Brent Pry, a good old Lexington guy there, seems to be doing a good job creating some buzz, doing a little recruiting. Why don't we go through the Hokies schedule to close this out?
Yep.
They have a brutal, they have a long time for a bye week, but the back end of their schedule's very favorable. They open with Old Dominion. They play Purdue, Rutgers, Marshall, Pitt, Florida State, and Wake Forest. What do you think about that opening stretch?
Yeah, I mean, I think if they can kind of just keep it together through those first 6 or 7 games and not let the season go off of the rails, I totally agree that Virginia Tech's not a great team. Um, and right now, they're having to learn how to win. That's a program that's just kind of been sinking over the last few years. They've got a cult. It's hard to believe, especially after the program that Frank Beamer built. But I mean, they kind of have a culture of losing, especially mentally. I think they have enough talent to be in a lot of games. Um, they just don't know how to close. That you really get a feel that they don't know how to close out games, and you saw that last year. They did become a better team as the season went on, but I'm looking at here in a schedule here. They lost a single-digit game to Miami, NC State, Georgia Tech. Okay, Duke was just better than them, and then they did beat a Liberty team there. But I mean, they were in a lot of games and couldn't usually close them out. So if they can just hold things together early in the season, if Old Dominion, I don't know, that's kind of the worst, one of the worst series is in the ACC. They got like some 10-year series with Old Dominion, on the road and at home, and they beat you, which is like a disaster for your season. They lost to them last year, but say you take care of them this year, if you can get a split with Purdue, Rutgers, you got to keep an eye on Marshall. I mean, they went into Notre Dame and won last year. Um, if you can just come out of that one, let's see, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. If somehow you could get through the first 4, 2-2, you might have a chance to have something on the season. Okay, you're not maybe you can pull an upset with Pittsburgh. You're not winning at Florida State. So if you can get through those first 6 at 3-3, that you've got a chance to maybe have a decent year.
It would not surprise me if they come out 2-5. I mean, I think they can beat Old Dominion. They catch Purdue early, which should be good. I think they could win that game. Rutgers and Marshall, you don't know. Pitt, this could be the game Pitt just inexplicably loses, but I
Yeah.
don't think they beat Florida State. Wake probably is rolling by that point. But then the back end is not bad for them. They've got Syracuse, which I think they can win. They got Louisville, which I think they can win. Boston College, which they ought to win, or they get rid of the football program. Then they've got NC State, who they played pretty tough last year.
Yep.
And then they close out against Virginia, which again ought to be a winner. They get rid of the football program. So how do you think that the Hokies close things out?
I totally agree with you. The back end of the schedule, those last 5, provide an opportunity. If that team is improving, I can see a scenario where they go 4-1 to finish the season. You still can't, it's not the environment in Blacksburg is still second to none. They've been losing there, but if you get a little bit on a roll and you get that crowd behind you, you should beat Syracuse. You've got an opportunity to beat NC State. I think you go into the season and you're very similar to Boston College. And even though you go on the road at Virginia, you've owned them for close to 25 years. So, I mean, that as opposed to Virginia, I think there are opportunities for Virginia Tech, to put together a decent season.
And let's talk about how the Hokies closed the season. They lost by 6 to Miami, by a point to NC State on the road, by a point to Georgia Tech. Duke just, I don't want to necessarily say ran them out of the building, but what I do want to say is Duke probably should have scored more than just 24 in that game. But Virginia Tech's offense was so bad that it made it just impossible for them to win. Game should have been a little bit closer, but then they close out with a win against Liberty. And I think we all would have, had the game been played, expected Virginia Tech to beat Virginia. So sometimes what you see with those teams that learn how to win is it's because they lost a lot of close games. They know what they need to do differently, and then they close them out. I mean, those games go differently. They're looking at a bowl game right there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, they squeak into a bowl game. So those margins are real thin. What are your thoughts on the floor and ceiling for the Hokies?
They're still not a good team, if we're being honest. So, I mean, if they have to definitely upgrade the talent overall at Virginia Tech. On our blog, we're going through, the top players in the ACC, and you don't see very many Virginia Tech players on there at all. I think I'm almost through the all the positions, and I only have 1 or 2, in the top 5. So they definitely need a boost of talent there. I could see a floor of 4-8, and because especially that back end of the schedule is manageable, I could see a ceiling of 7-5.
Okay, so a chance for a bowl game there for the Hokies. Now, a couple remaining matters. Which teams and coaches do you think have the most pressure on them this season? The old Atlantic coaches.
I think Jeff Hafley and Dino.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I meant to say the old Coastal. I apologize.
Okay. The Coastal.
Sorry.
Because they're new coaches, I think even no matter how poorly they do, they would probably get a 3rd season. But Mario Cristobal at Miami, needs to show something in his second year. They didn't get him out of Oregon, to go 5-7, 6-6. I mean, he's there to try to get Miami back to national relevance. And if he puts together another 5+ loss season, he's gonna feel heat. He was feeling it last year in the first year there, when their season kind of went the wrong direction. So I think there's a quite a bit of pressure on Cristobal. Tony Elliott, because the expectations at Virginia are a little bit lower, and then faced with what happened last year at the end of the season, I think they're going to be a little more flexible with him. But at the same time, if he goes 2-10, 2-10, following last year's season, there'll be heat on him as well. It's hard to see a scenario where a coach just gets outright fired because of, there's not someone who's been there like 5 years and hasn't produced. I think there's some heat on Mac Brown. If they really have a poor season, the heat's going to rise on him because, North Carolina's been competitive, but they can't quite, they just don't seem to be able to put it all together and put a consistent full season. But I would put probably Mac Brown a little bit behind the other two.
I think that's right. Now, I do think if Elliott has a really bad year, it's going to be hard to have people who are wanting to keep him there. I also think if Mac Brown is hovering around 7 or 8 wins, that's probably going to be it for him, just because more is expected.
That's
and
fair.
I think I can't remember how many years this is for him now, if it's 4 or 5, but if you're 7 or 8 wins in your 5th year, I think naturally the inclination is going to be, let's see what else we can make happen. But we'll have to wait and see, of course. We talked a little bit about ACC. Seems like it's going to be in its current form at least for another 5 or 7 years, something like that. But tell us what else you think. You've answered a lot of questions and you listen, so you know this. You get an open mic. Tell us anything you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, and I think you hit it on it, Ben. All these Twitter rumors and stuff about. There's a couple things that I think are just absolutely 100% not true. One of them, where this stuff keeps coming up about ESPN kind of orchestrating the demise of the ACC and pulling off teams, putting them in the SEC, making deals to get, ACC teams in the Big Ten for this and that. Absolutely not going to happen. The ESPN will not initiate the demise of the ACC. If it ever came to where they were a part of it, it would have been a reaction to something else. But they're absolutely not gonna, be behind the scenes working to break up the ACC. That's just one of those myths. I don't know how it gained traction, but it's absolutely not going to happen. I mean, they're so intertwined together, bad deal or not. I mean, they're completely intertwined contracts, the ACC network, 50-50 owners. Yeah, that's not happening. I totally agree with you. There are things to keep an eye on, but I don't would be absolutely stunned if you saw any kind of movement in the next 5 years. This grant of rights, it's going to be tough to break, and people have looked at it previously. If they could break it, it would have already happened. Texas, Oklahoma, and leaving the Big 12. So I think things are going to be pretty stable over the next 5 years, no matter what the rumors are. And during this time, Jim Phillips, got to get to work on the revenue. Start, telling us how's he going to increase it. You can only use the bad deal, for an excuse is so long. Yeah, we know it's bad. Everyone agrees on that, but you've got 5 years to work on it. That's your job now. And you maybe inherited a bad situation, but that's the job you were hired to do. So we'll see how that goes. But realignment's kind of interesting to talk about. But I'm ready to get into the football. And so yeah, it's been a really good show to talk about the Coastal, and it's got me ready to go.
Well, Big Ten, there was some talk about maybe getting Jim Phillips over there. Let's see what we can do to make a trade. Maybe give you Phillips, and we'll do a player to be named later. Maybe Phillips isn't that bad. Maybe he's just waiting. And sometimes, in fairness, leadership can be waiting, right? It can be just kind of letting things play themselves out. Maybe that's what he's doing, but sending a memo to tell people not to complain about the refs is not really a sign that you know what you're doing, right?
That's not what we really want to hear. I want the commissioner of the ACC to talk about one thing right now, and that's the revenue portion of it. If you got officials and statements like that you want to talk about, put that to you got an executive staff, have one of them make a statement concerning that. I want you working on revenue 100% of the time.
I think that's 100% accurate, and I think that's what I think he's got priorities that would confuse all of us, right? And just don't seem to make that much sense. But Jeff, I really appreciate you coming on. I really appreciate you taking some time to be with us on the podcast again. Big thanks to everybody who's come on this season: Matthew, Colby Campbell, Lauren Brownlow, Ron Frederick, Jackson Hubbard, Connor Vernon, Connor O'Neill, Desmond Scott, Chris Combs, Roanoke guy, Brett from Pick Six, John Tavis Robertson, Joe Ovius, and Dan Siegel. And Jeff, thank all of you for coming on. We're working on locking down everything for season 4. The format's going to be very different. I've enjoyed these discussions with the people who cover the ACC and cover different teams. So I'm going to have beat reporters and bloggers on each week to talk about Duke's opponents. Not necessarily each week. I'm going to try to do it each week. I've got a lot of guests lined up. I need to line up a few more. So this is going to be exciting. Hopefully we can do all of them or almost all of them, and we'll see what season 4 brings us as we get to know our opponents a little bit better. Again, you can find us anywhere you get your podcast. Check out our website, bullcitycoordinators.com. Find us on Twitter at DukeFBCoverage. We are on Reddit and a lot of the social medias. Just hit us up. And thank you guys for listening. It really means a lot. I enjoy that I'm still doing this. I don't have as much time as I used to when I started, just because we've just been so busy at work, which is a good thing. So I'll keep doing it as long as I can. And I really appreciate all of you listening. And I hope you get something good out of it. Now, until we come back for season 4, I'll just say this. As always, go Duke.